Sometimes the biggest mistakes happen in the smallest seconds. A split-second decision. A swing thrown in anger. A challenge issued to the wrong person at the wrong time. What happens when military authority meets someone who doesn't recognize rank, doesn't care about stripes, and has nothing left to lose? This is the story of Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a decorated NCO who thought his uniform meant something everywhere he went. It's about the night he learned that respect isn't given, it's earned. And, sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. In a small Texas town, outside a dive bar where everyone knows everyone else's business, one punch would change everything. Not just for the sergeant, but for an entire community watching what happens when pride meets reality. The swing was thrown. The lesson was learned. But the real story? That's just beginning. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had always believed his uniform opened doors. 22 years in the Army, 3 deployments, and enough commendations to fill a shadow box had taught him that respect came with the territory. When people saw those 3 stripes on his sleeve, they stepped aside. They said yes sir even though he wasn't an officer. They bought him drinks and thanked him for his service. That Friday night in Millerville, Texas, Mike thought it would be no different. The town sat like a forgotten penny on the highway between San Antonio and nowhere important. Population 1,847 according to the faded sign by the city limits, though half those folks had probably moved on years ago. Main Street held the essentials: a gas station, a diner that closed at 6, a hardware store, and Murphy's Pub, the kind of place where the beer was cold, the music was loud, and everybody knew your business before you walked through the door. Mike had driven down from Fort Hood with his buddy Jake, another sergeant looking to blow off steam after a particularly brutal week of training exercises. They'd heard about Murphy's from some of the local guys: authentic dive bar, good people, cheap drinks. The kind of place where soldiers could relax without having to watch their backs or their language. The bar lived up to its reputation. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, decorated with faded photographs of local high school football teams and a few signed pictures of country music stars who'd probably played there decades ago. The smell of cigarette smoke clung to everything despite the smoking ban, mixed with the aroma of fried food and spilled beer that had soaked into the floorboards over the years. Murphy himself worked behind the bar, a thick-set man in his 60s with calloused hands and kind eyes. He'd served in Vietnam, which was obvious from the way he carried himself and the Marine Corps flag hanging behind the register. When Mike and Jake walked in wearing their off-duty clothes but still carrying themselves like soldiers, Murphy nodded with recognition. "What'll it be, boys?" Murphy asked, already reaching for 2 beer glasses. "Couple of buds," Mike said, sliding onto a bar stool. "Heard this was the place to be on Friday night." "Depends what you're looking for," Murphy replied with a slight smile. "We got cold beer, decent burgers, and mostly good people." "That enough excitement for you?" The bar was filling up with the usual Friday crowd. Factory workers from the plant outside town, a few ranchers still wearing their work boots, some college kids home for the weekend. The conversation buzzed with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd known each other their whole lives. Mike felt good. Anonymous in a good way, surrounded by regular folks just trying to unwind after a long week. He and Jake found a table near the back, ordered another round, and settled in to watch the Rangers game on the big screen TV. That's when she walked in. Sarah Chin wasn't what anyone in Millerville expected when they thought about trouble walking through a door. 5'4", maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, with straight black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. But Mike noticed her immediately. So did half the bar. It wasn't her looks, though she was pretty in a natural, understated way. It was something else, the way she moved through the room like she owned it, the way her dark eyes took in everything without seeming to look at anything in particular. She walked to the bar with the confidence of someone who'd been coming here for years, even though Mike was pretty sure he'd never seen her before. "Evening, Sarah," Murphy said, already reaching for something under the bar. "Hey, Murph." The usual. Murphy set down a bottle of beer, no glass, and a small plate with a few pretzels. Sarah left exact change on the bar and found an empty table near the pool tables in the back corner. "You know her?" Jake asked quietly. Mike shook his head. "First time seeing her. But she seems to know everybody." That was true. As the evening went on, people stopped by Sarah's table to chat. The conversations were brief but friendly. She'd nod, sometimes laugh, occasionally shake hands. But she never got up from her table, never joined any of the larger groups, never seemed to need anyone's company but her own. Mike found himself watching her more than the game. There was something fascinating about her self-containment, the way she seemed completely comfortable in her own space. Most people in bars were there to be social, to connect, to fill some kind of void with noise and company. Sarah just seemed to be there to exist. Around 9 o'clock, things started getting louder. The Rangers were losing, which put some folks in a bad mood. The college kids at the front had switched from beer to shots and were getting rowdy. Someone had fed the jukebox enough quarters to keep it running, and the music was competing with raised voices and increasingly animated conversations. Mike was 3 beers in and feeling social when he noticed a problem developing near the pool tables. 2 guys in their 20s, clearly college boys trying to look tough, had approached Sarah's table. From where Mike sat, he couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear enough. They wanted her to join them for a game of pool. She was politely declining. They weren't taking no for an answer. "Come on, sweetheart," one of them said loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "One game. We'll even let you break." Sarah didn't even look up from her beer. "Thanks, but I'm good." "Don't be like that," the other one pressed, leaning over her table. "We're just trying to be friendly." Now she looked up. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that should have made the smart boys back off immediately. "I appreciate the offer," she said in a voice that carried despite being quiet. "But I said no." The first guy, a big kid with the soft look of someone who'd never done real physical work, laughed and looked around the bar as if expecting support. "Hear that? Princess here is too good for us regular folks." That got some attention. Conversations started dying down as people turned to watch the show. Mike felt his protective instincts kicking in. He'd seen this scenario play out before: drunk guys who couldn't handle rejection, escalating situations that didn't need to escalate. "Maybe you boys should find another game," Murphy called from behind the bar. His tone was friendly but carried a warning. "We're just talking," the second guy said, but he stayed leaning over Sarah's table, clearly invading her space intentionally. Sarah set down her beer very carefully. "Last time I'm asking nicely," she said. "Please move away from my table." The big guy laughed again. "Or what? You gonna call your boyfriend?" That's when Mike stood up. He wasn't sure what his plan was, exactly. Maybe just walk over and de-escalate things. Suggest the guys back off before Murphy threw them out. Use his size and presence to give Sarah some breathing room. He was good at that, reading situations, knowing when to step in, how to use authority to solve problems without violence. But, as he approached the table, the big guy turned toward him and Mike got a better look at the situation. The kid was drunk, aggressive, and clearly the type who saw backing down as weakness. His buddy was nervous but committed to standing with his friend. Sarah was sitting very still, but Mike could see tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay over here?" Mike asked, using his military voice, calm but commanding. The big guy looked him up and down, taking in Mike's size, his bearing, the confidence that came with years of leadership experience. For a second, it looked like the smart play would win out. Then, the kid's pride took over. "Yeah, everything's fine, soldier boy. Why don't you mind your own business?" Mike felt his jaw tighten. "I'm making it my business. The lady asked you to leave her alone. Time to move on." "Or what?" The kid stepped closer, and Mike could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You gonna make me?" The bar was getting quiet now. Even the jukebox seemed to be playing at lower volume. This was the moment that could go either way: de-escalation or confrontation. Mike looked at Sarah, expecting to see gratitude or at least acknowledgement of his intervention. Instead, her expression was almost annoyed. "I got this," she said quietly. "But, thanks." The big guy laughed. "See? She's got this. Little lady can handle herself." That's when he made his mistake. Instead of walking away, he reached out and patted Sarah on the shoulder, a condescending gesture that was meant to prove his point about her being just a little lady. Sarah moved so fast that Mike almost missed it. 1 second the kid's hand was coming down toward her shoulder. The next second his wrist was trapped in her grip and he was bent forward over the table, his face pressed against the wood, making a sound that was part surprise and part pain. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a quality that made everyone in the immediate area step back. The second guy started to move toward her, and that's when Mike's training kicked in. He stepped between them, hands up in a peacekeeping gesture. "Whoa there, nobody needs to." The kid with his wrist trapped was struggling, trying to pull free. "Let go of me, you crazy." Sarah increased the pressure slightly, and his words cut off in a yelp. "Apologize," she said. "What?" "For putting your hands on me without permission." "Apologize." The bar was dead silent now. Even Murphy had stopped wiping glasses to watch what was happening. "I'm sorry," the kid gasped. "Sorry, okay? Just let go." Sarah released his wrist, and he stumbled backward, cradling his arm. His friend helped steady him, both of them looking shocked and embarrassed. "Maybe find another bar," Mike suggested, still standing between them and Sarah's table. They didn't need to be told twice. The two college boys made their way quickly toward the exit, the big guy muttering under his breath about crazy women and unfair advantages. Mike turned back to Sarah, expecting, he wasn't sure what. A thank you? An explanation? Some acknowledgement of what had just happened. Instead, she was looking at him with something that might have been amusement. "Nice moves," he said, pulling out a chair at her table. "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the chair. "Free country." As he settled in across from her, Mike realized he had no idea what he'd just witnessed. The woman sitting across from him had just handled two aggressive guys with the kind of precision and control that spoke of serious training. But she looked like a small-town girl who probably worked at the bank or taught kindergarten. "I'm Mike," he said, extending his hand. She shook it briefly. Her grip was firm, calloused. "Sarah. You from around here?" "Born and raised." She took a sip of her beer, studying him over the bottle. "You're military." It wasn't a question. "Guilty." "Fort Hood." "You could tell?" "The way you carry yourself. The way you positioned yourself when those idiots were acting up. The fact that you assumed I needed rescuing." There was no hostility in her voice, but Mike felt criticism in the words anyway. "Did I assume wrong?" he asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd sat down. It transformed her face completely, making her look younger and more approachable. "No," she said. "But I didn't need rescuing. I needed them to learn not to put their hands on people without permission. And you taught them." "I taught them." Mike was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd seen. The move she'd used to control the bigger guy hadn't been lucky or desperate. It had been textbook, the kind of joint manipulation technique they taught in advanced combat training. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. Sarah's smile faded slightly. "Here and there." The deflection was polite but clear. Mike recognized it, the same tone he used when civilians asked about his deployment experiences. Some things weren't for casual conversation. The bar was gradually returning to normal volume and activity. People were going back to their own conversations, though Mike caught occasional glances in their direction. Apparently, Sarah handling herself wasn't completely unusual, but it was still worth watching. "Can I buy you another beer?" Mike asked. "I buy my own drinks," Sarah replied. "But you can buy yourself one and drink it at this table if you want." Mike found himself genuinely smiling for the first time all evening. There was something refreshing about her directness, her lack of pretense. Most people either tried too hard to impress him or treated him with the kind of automatic deference that came with seeing his military bearing. Sarah just treated him like a person. He went to the bar, bought 2 beers, and came back to find Sarah watching the Rangers game on the TV visible from their table. "You follow baseball?" he asked, setting her beer down. "Sometimes. More of a football person, really." She glanced at him. "You?" "Both. NFL season's coming up." "Cowboys fan?" "Local high school," she said. "Millerville Wildcats. State champions 3 years running until the good coach moved away." They talked about sports for a while, then, about the town, the difference between small-town life and military bases, the weather, safe topics that let them get used to each other's company without diving into personal territory. Mike found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. Sarah was easy to talk to, intelligent without being showy about it, funny in a dry way that caught him off guard, clearly well-read despite her simple presentation. But, underneath the pleasant conversation, he sensed depths he couldn't quite fathom. Around 10:30, Jake appeared at the table looking slightly drunk and very ready to head back to base. "There you are," he said to Mike. "I've been looking all over. You ready to roll?" Mike looked at Sarah, then back at Jake. "Give me 5 minutes?" Jake wandered off toward the bathroom, and Mike turned back to Sarah. "This has been..." He started, then stopped. What had it been? Nice? Interesting? Confusing? Unexpected, Sarah finished. "Yeah. Unexpected." Mike pulled out his phone. "Could I get your number? Maybe take you to dinner sometime?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't date military," she said finally. The words hit Mike harder than he expected. "Can I ask why?" "Personal policy." Her tone was still friendly, but there was finality in it. Mike nodded, trying not to show his disappointment. "Fair enough. Can't blame a guy for asking." "No," Sarah agreed. "You can't." Mike stood up, leaving money on the table for both their drinks. "Well, it was really nice meeting you, Sarah. Thanks for an interesting evening." She looked up at him, and, for a moment her expression softened. "Drive safe, Mike." As he walked away, Mike felt like he was missing something important, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The woman at that table was more than she appeared to be, and her refusal to date military felt like it came with a story behind it. He met Jake at the front door, and they made their way out into the humid Texas night. "How'd it go?" Jake asked as they climbed into Mike's truck. "Struck out," Mike admitted. "But it was worth the conversation." "She seemed interesting." "Little intense, maybe." Mike started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, glancing back at Murphy's in his rearview mirror. Through the window, he could see Sarah still sitting at her table, back to watching the game. "Yeah," he said. "Definitely interesting." The drive back to Fort Hood was quiet, Jake dozing in the passenger seat and Mike replaying the evening in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone important, even if nothing was going to come of it. What he didn't know was that he'd be back in Millerville sooner than expected, and the next time he saw Sarah Chen, the circumstances would be very different. 3 weeks later, Mike found himself driving back through Millerville under very different circumstances. This time, he wasn't looking for a relaxing evening or a cold beer. He was angry, embarrassed, and looking for answers. The previous Friday, Mike had been at another bar in Killeen with some guys from his unit. The conversation had turned to women, as it often did, and Mike had found himself talking about the mysterious Sarah Chen from Murphy's Pub. He described her as intriguing, mentioned her ability to handle herself, talked about how she'd shut down those college boys with what looked like professional-level training. "Sounds like military," his friend Rodriguez had suggested. "Maybe former Air Force. They teach hand-to-hand now." "She said she doesn't date military," Mike had replied. Seemed like there was a story there. That's when Corporal Danny Hutchins had started laughing. "Wait," Danny said, nearly spilling his beer. "Asian girl, about this tall?" He held his hand at shoulder height. "Dark hair, works out, handles herself like she knows what she's doing?" "You know her?" Mike asked. "Know of her," Danny replied, his grin getting wider. "Dude, that's Sarah Chen. She's like a legend around here." Danny proceeded to tell a story that left Mike feeling like an idiot. According to Danny, Sarah Chen wasn't just some small-town girl who happened to know a few self-defense moves. She was former military, Marine Corps, Special Operations, multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. And, not just former military. She'd been medically discharged after an IED incident that left her with a Purple Heart, a chest full of commendations, and what Danny described as serious issues with authority figures. Especially military authority figures, Danny had added with obvious amusement. Story goes she punched out a lieutenant colonel who got too handsy at a welcome home ceremony. Right in front of his wife and the base commander. The story got worse from there. Apparently, Sarah had a reputation for not backing down from anyone, regardless of rank or size. Danny had heard about incidents at bars around Fort Hood where she'd embarrassed soldiers who thought they could intimidate her or impress her with their tough guy attitudes. She doesn't just not date military, Danny had concluded. She actively dislikes us. Something about the war messing with her head, making her unable to deal with the whole hierarchy thing anymore. Mike had listened to all this with growing embarrassment. He'd been so confident in his approach at Murphy's, so sure that his military bearing and leadership presence would be assets in winning her over. Now he realized he'd been exactly the kind of guy she was actively trying to avoid. But what really bothered him wasn't the rejection. It was the feeling that she'd been humoring him, letting him play the part of the helpful soldier while knowing all along that she could have handled the situation better than he could. The whole conversation suddenly felt like she'd been laughing at him behind that polite smile. By Sunday, Mike's embarrassment had turned into something closer to anger. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like Sarah had made a fool of him. She'd let him think he was being protective and helpful when she was probably the most dangerous person in the bar that night. It felt like a setup, like she'd enjoyed watching him play the part of the white knight rescuing the helpless local girl. By Tuesday, he'd convinced himself that he needed to go back and clear the air. He told himself it was about honesty, about having a real conversation now that he knew who she really was. But, underneath that rationalization was something else, a wounded pride that wanted to prove he wasn't just another easily dismissed soldier. So there he was on a Wednesday evening, driving through Millerville again with no real plan beyond confronting Sarah about the game she'd been playing with him. Murphy's was quieter on a weeknight. Maybe 20 people scattered around the bar, mostly older locals nursing beers and watching the news. Murphy himself was behind the bar again, and he nodded to Mike with the same friendly recognition as before. "Back again?" Murphy asked. "Thought you boys usually stuck to the weekend crowds." "Looking for Sarah," Mike said, scanning the room. "She here tonight?" Murphy's expression shifted slightly. "She might be." "Why?" The protective tone in Murphy's voice should have been Mike's first clue that this approach was a mistake. Instead, it just reinforced his suspicion that everyone in this bar had been laughing at him behind his back. "Just want to talk to her," Mike said. Murphy studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the back corner. "Pool table." Mike turned and saw her. Sarah was playing solo 8-ball, moving around the table with the same quiet confidence she'd shown the week before. She was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, her hair pulled back in the same simple ponytail. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but, knowing what he knew now, Mike could see things differently. The way she held herself wasn't just self-possession, it was the bearing of someone who'd been in combat. The calluses on her hands weren't from manual labor, they were from weapons training. Even the way she lined up her shots had a precision that spoke of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. Mike walked over, his jaw set with determination. "Evening," he said. Sarah looked up from the table, cue stick in hand. Her expression when she saw him was neutral, but Mike thought he caught a flicker of something. Resignation? Annoyance? "Mike, right," she said. Back for more small-town atmosphere? Actually, I came back to talk to you. About what?
Mike looked around the bar, suddenly aware that several people were watching their interaction with interest. This wasn't going to be a private conversation.
About why you didn't mention your former military, he said, keeping his voice low. Sarah's expression didn't change, but she set the cue stick down on the table. And why would I mention that to a random soldier I just met? Because we talked for an hour. Because you let me think I was helping you with those guys when you could have handled them with one hand tied behind your back. I did handle them. You know what I mean.
Sarah picked up her beer from a nearby table and took a slow sip, clearly considering her response.
What exactly is your problem, Mike? The question caught him off guard. My problem? Yeah. Your problem.
You're angry about something, and I'm trying to figure out what.
Mike felt his face getting warm. My problem is that you played games with me. Let me think you needed help when you're apparently some kind of special forces badass. Made me look like an idiot.
You made yourself look like an idiot, Sarah replied calmly.
I never asked for your help. I told you I had it handled. You insisted on inserting yourself into the situation anyway.
Several people at nearby tables had stopped their own conversations to listen. Mike was aware of the audience, and it was making his anger worse.
You could have said something. Could have been honest instead of letting me play the protector for your amusement.
Sarah set down her beer and faced him fully.
Honest about what? My military service? My medical discharge? My PTSD diagnosis? My Purple Heart?
Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now.
Which part of my personal history was I obligated to share with a stranger in a bar?
Mike felt the first stirrings of doubt about his approach, but his pride was committed now. The part that would have kept me from making an ass of myself, he said.
The only person responsible for your behavior is you, Sarah replied. I didn't ask you to intervene. I didn't lead you on. I didn't promise you anything.
I had a conversation with you, thanked you for your concern, and politely declined your invitation.
What exactly did I do wrong?
The question hung in the air between them. Mike could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, could sense that public opinion was not swinging his way. But he was too deep into this confrontation to back down gracefully. You could have been straight with me, he said.
I was straight with you. I told you I don't date military. That was honest. Because of what happened over there. Sarah's expression went completely cold. Excuse me? Your issues with authority. Your problems with military guys. Whatever happened in Afghanistan that messed with your head?
The silence that followed was deafening. Mike immediately knew he'd crossed a line, but the words were already out there. Sarah's face had gone pale, and her hands, resting on the pool table, were absolutely still. What did you just say to me? She asked, her voice deadly quiet.
Mike realized he was in serious trouble, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I'm just saying, maybe your judgment about military personnel is affected by whatever you went through. Maybe you're not thinking clearly about. He never finished the sentence. Sarah moved faster than he could track.
One moment she was standing by the pool table, the next moment Mike was on his back on the floor with his arm twisted at an angle that made his shoulders scream with pain. His face was pressed against the sticky bar floor, and Sarah's knee was on his back, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobilized without causing permanent damage. The bar erupted in surprised shouts and the scraping of chair legs as people either moved closer to see what was happening or backed away to give them space. My judgment, Sarah said, her voice still conversational despite the fact that she had a 200-pound sergeant pinned like a child, is perfectly clear.
Clear enough to recognize an entitled asshole when I meet one.
Mike tried to struggle, but Sarah had him positioned so that any movement just increased the pressure on his shoulder joint. It was a textbook restrained hold, applied with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training and real-world experience.
The reason I don't date military, she continued, isn't because I have issues with authority. It's because too many of you think your rank means something off base. Think your service gives you the right to women's gratitude.
Think you're entitled to explanations about our personal lives and histories.
Let me up, Mike gasped. In a minute. We're having a conversation.
Murphy had come around the bar and was standing nearby, but he made no move to intervene. In fact, Mike caught a glimpse of his face and saw something that looked almost like approval. The reason I don't date military, Sarah went on, is because I've met too many guys like you. Guys who think they know better than I do what's good for me.
Guys who think my trauma is their business.
Guys who think they can diagnose my mental health based on 5 minutes of bar talk. She increased the pressure slightly, and Mike's vision went white for a second.
You want to know what happened in Afghanistan? Fine.
I'll tell you.
I was a combat medic.
I spent 18 months patching up Marines who were trying to hold territory that didn't matter against an enemy that could disappear into the civilian population. I saw kids, American kids, die from wounds that should have been survivable because we couldn't get them to proper medical facilities fast enough.
The bar was completely silent now. Even the TV seemed to have been muted.
I was riding in the lead vehicle of a convoy when we hit an IED. The explosion killed my driver instantly.
Killed the gunner. Blew off my left ear and gave me a traumatic brain injury that took 8 months of rehabilitation to recover from. Mike stopped struggling.
The pain in his shoulder was nothing compared to the weight of what she was saying. When I got back stateside, I had officers, good officers, officers I respected, telling me I should be grateful to be alive.
Telling me I should focus on healing instead of being angry. Telling me that my attitude toward authority figures was a symptom of PTSD that I needed to work on.
Sarah's voice was getting harder, more controlled. What they didn't understand was that my attitude toward authority figures wasn't trauma.
It was clarity. I'd seen what happened when people followed orders without question.
I'd seen what happened when rank mattered more than common sense. I'd seen good people die because someone with more stripes made bad decisions. She shifted positions slightly, and Mike felt the pressure on his back change. So when some sergeant I just met thinks he knows better than I do about my own mental health, thinks he can push me around because he's bigger and stronger and used to people following his orders, it doesn't trigger my PTSD.
It pisses me off.
Mike wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, but Sarah wasn't finished. You came in here tonight looking for a fight because your ego couldn't handle being turned down by a woman you thought was beneath you. You made assumptions about my capabilities, my history, and my mental health based on gossip and your own prejudices. And then, you had the nerve to suggest that I'm the one who's not thinking clearly. She released the pressure on his arm and stood up, leaving Mike gasping on the floor. The next time you want to have a conversation about military service and trauma, Sarah said, looking down at him, maybe start by asking questions instead of making accusations. Mike rolled over and sat up slowly, his shoulder throbbing. Every person in the bar was staring at him. Some looked shocked, some looked sympathetic, but most looked like they thought he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. Sarah walked back to the pool table, picked up her cue stick, and lined up her next shot as if nothing had happened. You might want to leave now, Murphy suggested quietly, appearing at Mike's elbow with a bar towel.
Before someone decides to call the MPs.
Mike struggled to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment and something else, shame, maybe, or the beginning of real understanding. He looked at Sarah, who was concentrating on her shot with complete focus, and realized that everything Danny had told him about her reputation was probably understated.
Sarah, he said. She didn't look up from the table. We're done talking, Mike. Mike walked toward the exit on unsteady legs, feeling every eye in the place on his back.
At the door, he turned for one last look at the woman who had just taught him the most humbling lesson of his military career. Sarah Chen was chalking her cue stick, her expression calm and focused. She looked exactly like what she was, a warrior who had earned her stripes the hard way and didn't need anyone's protection or permission to exist in the world. Mike pushed through the door into the humid Texas night, his shoulder aching and his pride in ruins. But, underneath the embarrassment and physical pain, something else was starting to take shape.
Respect, maybe.
And the unsettling realization that everything he thought he knew about strength and service and what it meant to be a soldier had just been called into question by a 5'4" Marine who didn't need his approval or understanding to be exactly who she was.
As he drove back to Fort Hood, Mike replayed the confrontation over and over in his mind.
Every word Sarah had said, every assumption he'd made, every moment when he could have chosen a different approach. By the time he reached the base, he knew two things for certain. First, he owed Sarah Chin an apology that was bigger than anything he'd ever had to give before.
Second, he was probably going to have to go back to Millerville to deliver it. Mike didn't go back to Murphy's pub for 6 months.
Part of it was pride. Part of it was the knowledge that showing up again would probably result in another public humiliation, possibly involving the local sheriff's department this time. But, mostly, it was because he'd spent those 6 months thinking about what Sarah had said to him, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the conversation that needed to happen. The first few weeks after the incident were rough. Word had gotten around Fort Hood about the sergeant who'd been taken down by a former Marine in a small-town bar. Different versions of the story circulated through the barracks and the NCO club, each one more exaggerated than the last.
In some versions, Sarah was a Navy SEAL. In others, Mike had been hospitalized.
In the most ridiculous version, she'd used a pool cue as a weapon.
Mike endured the jokes and the knowing looks without comment. What was he going to say? That the real story was worse than any of the rumors because it wasn't about being overpowered by a trained fighter, it was about being completely outclassed by someone who understood honor and service better than he did? After a month, the jokes faded away. After 2 months, most people had forgotten about it entirely. But Mike hadn't forgotten.
If anything, the memory had gotten sharper and more uncomfortable with time. He started reading about PTSD, about combat medicine, about the experiences of women in combat zones. He talked to some of the medics on base about what they'd seen downrange, about the particular challenges of trying to save lives in conditions where death was random and frequently unstoppable. He began to understand, in a very small way, what Sarah had been carrying when she walked into Murphy's that first night. He also started paying attention to his own behavior in ways he never had before. How quickly he assumed leadership in social situations.
How he responded when people challenged his opinions or his authority. How often he expected deference simply because of his rank and experience. The picture that emerged wasn't flattering.
Mike had always thought of himself as a good soldier and a decent person. He followed orders, took care of his men, and tried to treat people fairly. But he'd never questioned the assumption that his military experience made him qualified to judge other people's military experience. He'd never considered that his perspective on service and sacrifice might be limited by his own relatively comfortable role in the machine of war.
Sarah had been right about him. He was entitled. He did think his rank meant something it didn't. And, when a woman had the audacity to reject him without providing an explanation he found satisfactory, he decided her judgment was compromised rather than accepting that maybe he wasn't as impressive as he thought he was. The realization was depressing and liberating at the same time. By spring, Mike had been promoted to staff sergeant. The promotion came with new responsibilities and a transfer to a training unit at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio.
The move put him an hour closer to Millerville, which felt like either an opportunity or a cruel joke, depending on his mood. He'd driven through the town twice on his way to other places, both times slowing down as he passed Murphy's pub but never stopping. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, for the right words, for some sign that enough time had passed for Sarah to be willing to listen to what he had to say. The truth was, he was scared. Not of her physical capabilities, though he had a healthy respect for those now. He was scared that she'd see right through whatever apology he prepared, recognize it as more self-serving nonsense, and dismiss him the way he deserved to be dismissed. It was Jake who finally forced the issue. Mike's old friend had been transferred to Fort Bliss and was driving through Texas on his way to a new assignment. They met for dinner in San Antonio, and, after a few beers, Jake brought up the subject Mike had been avoiding for months.
"You ever go back to that bar in Millerville?" Jake asked. "No." "You ever talk to that girl again? Sarah?" Mike shook his head.
Dude, Jake said, leaning back in his chair. You've been carrying this thing around for months.
It's eating at you. I don't know what you're talking about. Come on. You think about her all the time. You bring up women in combat like every time we talk. Last month you spent 20 minutes explaining to me why the Marine Corps has better hand-to-hand training than the Army.
You're obsessed. Mike started to deny it, then stopped. Jake was right.
He was obsessed.
Not with Sarah specifically, but with the lesson she'd taught him and his failure to respond to it appropriately.
What am I supposed to do? Mike asked. Show up and say sorry for being an ignorant ass?
She made it pretty clear she didn't want to see me again.
Maybe.
Or maybe she was waiting to see if you were smart enough to figure out what you did wrong.
And if I wasn't?
Jake shrugged.
Then, you weren't worth her time anyway. That conversation happened on a Thursday.
By Saturday morning, Mike was driving toward Millerville with no plan beyond walking into Murphy's pub and accepting whatever happened next. The town looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago. Same faded welcome sign, same quiet main street, same sense of being a place where time moved differently than it did in the rest of the world. Mike parked outside Murphy's and sat in his truck for 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. When he finally walked through the door, it felt like stepping back in time. Murphy was behind the bar, the same country music was playing from the jukebox, and the same mix of locals were scattered around the room nursing drinks and watching college football on the big screen. Sarah was at her usual table in the back corner, but she wasn't alone. A man in his 50s sat across from her, wearing a VFW cap and a denim jacket covered in patches. He was gesturing as he spoke, clearly telling a story, and Sarah was listening with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than politeness. Mike hesitated near the door, unsure whether to approach or leave. Before he could decide, Murphy spotted him.
Well, look who's back, Murphy said loudly enough to catch Sarah's attention.
She looked up, saw Mike, and her expression went carefully neutral. The man in the VFW cap turned to see what she was looking at, took in Mike's military bearing, and turned back to Sarah with raised eyebrows.
Friend of yours? He asked.
Not exactly, Sarah replied, but she gestured for Mike to come over. Mike walked to the table on unsteady legs, feeling like he was approaching a live grenade.
Mike, this is Charlie Morrison, Sarah said.
Charlie, this is Mike Rodriguez.
The sergeant I told you about.
Charlie looked Mike up and down with the kind of assessment that came from decades of military experience.
You're the one who made assumptions about her mental health? Charlie asked. Mike felt his face burn. Yeah. That would be me.
Sit down, Charlie said, gesturing to an empty chair.
Let's talk.
For the next hour, Mike found himself in the strangest conversation of his life. Charlie Morrison, it turned out, was a Vietnam veteran who'd been coming to Murphy's for 15 years. He was also one of Sarah's closest friends and something of a mentor figure in her transition back to civilian life. Under Charlie's questioning, Mike found himself explaining his actions at the bar 6 months ago, his motivations, his assumptions, and his gradual understanding of how wrong he'd been about everything. Sarah mostly listened, occasionally asking pointed questions that made it clear she was evaluating not just his words but his sincerity. The thing is, Charlie said after Mike had finished his explanation, most people never figure out what you figured out. They stay stuck in their own perspective, thinking everyone else is the problem.
Sarah helped me figure it out, Mike said. Pretty forcefully. Sarah smiled slightly at that. You weren't listening to subtlety.
No, I wasn't. Charlie stood up, finished his beer, and put on his jacket. I'm going to leave you two to finish this conversation, he said.
Sarah, I'll see you next week. Mike, good luck.
After Charlie left, Mike and Sarah sat in silence for a moment. The bar had gotten busier as the evening progressed, but their corner table felt isolated from the noise and activity.
I owe you an apology, Mike said finally. Yes, you do. I came here tonight looking for a fight because my ego couldn't handle being rejected.
I made assumptions about your mental health and your military service based on gossip and my own prejudices. I was condescending, disrespectful, and completely out of line.
Sarah nodded. Go on. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what you said to me.
About entitlement, about thinking my rank means something it doesn't, about assuming I know better than other people about their own experiences. Mike paused, trying to find the right words.
The thing is, you were right about all of it.
I do think my service gives me authority I haven't earned. I do expect gratitude and deference from people who don't owe me either. And, when someone challenges that worldview, my first instinct is to question their judgment instead of examining my own behavior.
And, now? Sarah asked. Now I'm trying to do better.
Trying to listen more and assume less.
Trying to understand that my experience as a soldier doesn't make me an expert on everyone else's experience as a soldier. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face.
What do you want from me, Mike? She asked finally. It was a fair question, and Mike had been asking himself the same thing for months. I want to apologize properly, he said. I want you to know that I understand what I did wrong and why it was harmful. And I want to ask if there's any possibility of starting over.
Starting over how? As friends, maybe.
As people who understand each other better than we did 6 months ago. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering. I don't need your apology to feel better about what happened, she said. I handled the situation the way I needed to handle it, and I'm fine with how it turned out.
Mike nodded. I understand.
But, Sarah continued, I appreciate that you came back.
I appreciate that you took the time to think about what I said instead of just dismissing it.
And I appreciate that you're here to apologize because you think you were wrong, not because you want something from me.
So what does that mean?
Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since he'd walked in.
It means we can start over. As friends.
As two veterans who've both learned some hard lessons about pride and respect and what it really means to serve something bigger than yourself. They talked for another 2 hours. About their respective military experiences, about the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life, about the small-town community that had welcomed Sarah and the base community that had shaped Mike's adult identity. The conversation was easier than Mike had expected and more complex than he'd prepared for. Sarah was brilliant, funny, and deeply thoughtful about subjects he'd never considered seriously. She challenged his assumptions about everything from foreign policy to gender roles in the military, but she did it with the kind of intellectual rigor that made him want to rise to her level rather than defend his existing positions. When Murphy finally called last call, Mike realized he'd been having the kind of conversation he'd been looking for his entire adult life without knowing it.
Can I ask you something? He said as they walked toward the parking lot. Sure. Why did you give me a second chance? Most people wouldn't have.
Sarah stopped next to her truck and considered the question.
Charlie thinks everyone deserves a chance to grow, she said.
And I guess I wanted to see if you were smart enough and honest enough to figure out what you'd done wrong.
And you were. Eventually.
Mike laughed despite himself.
High praise. Don't let it go to your head.
They stood in the parking lot for a moment, the comfortable silence of people who'd found unexpected common ground.
Would you be interested in having dinner sometime? Mike asked.
Not a date, he added quickly. Just two friends continuing a conversation.
Sarah smiled. I'd like that. But I pick the restaurant. Deal.
As Mike drove back toward San Antonio, he reflected on how different this evening had been from his expectations. He'd come to Murphy's prepared to grovel, to accept whatever punishment Sarah thought he deserved, to close a chapter of his life that had been weighing on him for months. Instead, he'd found something he hadn't been looking for, a friendship with someone who challenged him to be better than he thought he could be.
Sarah Chen was still the most formidable person he'd ever met.
But now he understood that her strength came not from her ability to physically dominate opponents, but from her refusal to accept anything less than honesty and respect from the people around her. It was a standard Mike had failed to meet once. He was determined not to fail again. 6 months later, Mike and Sarah were best friends. A year after that, Charlie Morrison was the best man at their wedding, and Murphy's Pub hosted the reception. The story of how they met became legendary in Millerville, not as a cautionary tale about military arrogance, but as proof that sometimes the best relationships begin with someone caring enough to teach you a lesson you didn't know you needed to learn. Mike never forgot the feeling of being face down on a barroom floor with his pride and his assumptions in ruins around him. It was the worst and most important moment of his military career, and it led to everything good that came after.
Sometimes the biggest mistakes really do happen in the smallest seconds.
But sometimes, if you're lucky enough and humble enough, those mistakes become the foundation for something better than you ever thought possible.